Good afternoon. I'm Yumika Bennett, Executive Director of the New York Charter School Association. Thank you for joining our Thursday webinar. Many of you have likely been joining our weekly webinars on Tuesday afternoons where we get policy updates from authorizers and field questions. On Thursdays, we take a deep dive into specific subjects. As with prior webinars, we'll record today's event and make this recording and materials available on our website following the call. Our topic today is beginning the planning for student return to school. Note that we're addressing this topic from an academic planning perspective as opposed to operational perspective. We know a lot of you are already thinking about cleaning protocols and future adaptations to the school day. We will address operational planning at a future date when there's additional guidance from the governor and his team. To guide us through today's topic, we are thrilled to be joined by Jamila Newman, partner at TNTP, and Rebecca Sella, Executive Director at ANET. In addition to Jamila and Rebecca, we also have David Frank, Susie Corello, and Aaron Cochran here as authorizers, as well as Catherine Connell Espinoza, Chief of Staff at SUNY Charter Schools Institute, and Mike Lazinski, Director of Communications at SUNY. We'll hear first from David, Aaron, Catherine, and Mike to frame how their teams are thinking about student return to school. Then we'll hand it over to Jamila and Rebecca. Following our presentation, we fill questions in the Q&A feature, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Before I dive in, I want to make a quick note that we very much appreciate the partnership from TNTP and ANET. There are many ways to get to success. Today, we're just presenting thoughts on best practices that we hope are helpful to schools. Neither we nor the authorizers joining us are specifically endorsing any group or groups. Having said that, David, I'd like to start off with you. Welcome. I'm going to ask you to lead off the group today.
Thanks, Yumika and Jamila, Rebecca, Lindsay from ANET. It is really a pleasure to have you in partnership with us as authorizers and charter school support organizations so that schools across the state are not just thinking about how we can best serve children and close the achievement gap, but really share best practices, share effective practices, I should say, and really be at the forefront, not only in New York State, in terms of the work happening in the public education sector across the board, districts, charters, but also across the country. And actually, I was speaking with some of my colleagues who are on the call today, and I said, I wonder if people in other parts of the country are providing as robust supports and communication as we are here in New York. And I think the answer is no. And in part, I think the reason why we are so proactive in terms of our communication is through the support of partners and that we all come together because we know how important the challenges before us are. And so before I start, to echo what Yumika said, as an authorizer and particularly as the New York State Education Department, we do not endorse or suggest working with any group or groups. And there are many different ways to get to success. On this webinar, we're just presenting thoughts on effective practices that are perhaps one way to go, and we hope that are helpful to you as schools as you're thinking about not only instruction that you're delivering now remotely, but also how do you prepare to hit the ground running on day one when we're back in our brick and mortar environments. And being back in school, as I'm sure you've seen in news articles, from across the country and across the globe might look very different than the day before you left. It might involve social distancing. It might involve cohorts of students throughout the day. We just don't know yet, but we want you to prepare and to have some strategies that you can employ. We also encourage you to work with your families and communities as you're developing a reentry plan. We think that is of the utmost importance. Just like here, we're working together as a community. It's not just us sitting at SED or the DOE or SUNY, handing down on high requirements, but we're talking to one another. We're bringing back concerns and problems of practice that we hear from you on these calls, and we're able to then create policies and policy solutions, we hope, that are better and more proactive for children. The last thing I would leave you with is this work is not something that you do and then you file away in a drawer, or that you write down and then you execute. Just like your continuity of learning plans, your reentry plans are going to be living, breathing documents. They will change with the facts on the ground. We might know some things in the future that we don't know today. In fact, I would almost guarantee it. And so be thoughtful about iterative versions of this, bringing in different stakeholders, bringing in different facts, and create the best policies that are flexible for your students. We hope that you're being thoughtful about this, and we hope that you continue to try to reach every single student that's enrolled in your school, whether or not they're able to easily access your remote instruction or not. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from our partners at TNTP and ANET.
Great, thanks, David. I want to ask if Susie or Aaron wants to make any opening statements as well. Okay, I take that as
Catherine.
All right. So now we're going to turn right to Catherine.
Yomika, Catherine and Mike are going to speak on behalf of SUNY.
Hi, Yomika. Thanks so much. I apologize. So what I wanted to start with, again, thank you, Yomika, for introducing me. As she said, I am the Chief of Staff here at the SUNY Charter Schools Institute, and joined by Mike Lazinski. He is our Director of Communications. And so much of what we are doing and talking about really mirrors what David just said. It's so important to consider so many different things. This afternoon really provides an opportunity to bear with me. I'm just sharing my screen here for a second. This afternoon provides a great opportunity for us to get together. You know, we know that so many of our school leaders, your teachers, staff have questions, concerns, and, you know, are experiencing unique challenges during this time. So we want to be there as your authorizers to hear what's going on and to be a resource and thought partner. That is truly our frame in both ordinary and extraordinary times, to be here to support, monitor, share, and help prepare. So on this specific topic of restart, we want to, and we want our schools to, again, just like David said, really focus on the preparation piece, because that will help make better decisions across all of the other dimensions. We understand that restart will certainly not be like flipping a switch. Right now, we don't know when the schools are going to restart. It may be the end of June, it may be later in the summer, or even next fall. So with that, it is so important that you're thinking right now about what plans you need to put in place. It is an iterative process, just like those continuing education plans. You need to work with your teachers, staff, your families, all of the critical stakeholders whose needs have to be considered to ensure that when you open the doors, you're absolutely ready to take in your students and families.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so really, we all need to take a deep breath. When this crisis erupted and schools closed, what did our school leaders do? They gathered together with instructors to take a few days to come up with an educational continuity plan, to develop and distribute materials, and launch remote instruction in a timely manner. You know, I know from some of the conversations that we had that some of our schools surveyed their families to better understand their needs, and this process won't be dissimilar from that. So what we've been telling our schools is that they need to start the conversations with various stakeholders now so they can be better prepared and informed. So let's start with staff. You know, their health and the health of their families is going to impact your ability to deliver on your academic plan. So what are they concerned about? We know from school leaders that many members of their team have spread out as a result of this crisis. So how long will it take them to get back from wherever they are? How will they make it to and from work? Additionally, how can you support your staff's social and emotional needs? This experience and the impact that it's had on their mental health and their physical health is going to linger on. You know, we need to make sure they're taken care of. Instruction, of course, is a business that we're in. And, you know, this is a once in a lifetime, we hope, challenge, but instruction is why we exist. And while we know supporting the real and valued worries of teachers and parents and children is the path to preparing students to learn, thinking about learning should be a companion priority to everything that we do and we plan for. So, you know, what we're doing at the Institute is trying to think through what the world we come back to is, because it may be considerably different. So some of the questions that we're posing, you know, is this when schools begin to explore a blended learning model? If so, what does that look like for the students you serve? Is it feasible? How do you establish your school culture if social distancing continues, as David mentioned? You know, how do you make curriculum adjustments to make up for lost learning time? And where do credible assessments fit in, especially with younger students? And how are these assessments going to be used to monitor and adjust instruction as we move forward? Summer's also coming around. Are summer programs going to be delivered via distance learning? You talk to school leaders, and there is a real concern. If struggling students are not showing up now, how likely will it be that they show up in the summer? Conversely, if a school is doing well now with distance learning, are they going to keep it up until, you know, make sure that students are ready to return whenever that may be? And finally, you know, last but not least, parents and guardians. What will make families feel secure in sending their students back to school? How can you plan for those concerns now? And what do they need? What is currently missing that will help them ensure that their children can excel academically, regardless of whether learning is being done face-to-face, online, or in a blended format? That's why we think a focus group would probably be a really great idea. At the Institute, you know, whenever we reach out for advice, we say it is to make us smarter. So, you know, we know many of you have strong parent organizations, so lean on them to try to make yourself smarter. You know, at SUNY, we're going to be working with experts supporting all of our SUNY campuses and thinking how to reopen. We'll be collecting quantitative and qualitative data on assessments, on the curriculum, instructional leadership, governance, operations, capacity, and sharing those in the future. But really, the tough, hard decisions are going to be made by school leaders. It's going to be a balancing act based on the realities of your infrastructure and your budget and your staffing, your norms, and how quickly you probably change some of those norms. But good, meaningful data will be your best pathway forward. So, you know, just to close, you know, at SUNY, we grant charters. Susie loves to say this. You know, we grant charters because we want you to succeed. So we'll be there to, you know, support you along the way as we figure out these questions and try to discover these solutions together. So, you know, with that, I just want to pass it back over, and you know, we look forward to the rest of the presentation.
All right, great. Thank you both. I want to turn to Erin right now for a few comments and updates. Erin?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to really echo what other folks were saying and just honor the fact that it can be very challenging to do this type of contingency planning in the absence of knowing operationally what's happening. And so just wanted to take a minute and honor that. And so it may be necessary, or if it's helpful, come up with a couple different plans, one where school is perfectly in session as normal in September, one where we're continuing in remote learning, and just see what are the intersections of those plans, and maybe focus on that, you know what I mean? So if thought partnership would be helpful, definitely reach out to us. And we're just really happy to be engaging in these conversations at this point.
Great, thank you. And now we will turn it over to Jamila and Rebecca. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, and we're happy to hear your presentation.
Thanks so much, Yumika. And for everyone that we'll join in the sentiment that this is hard, and we're really happy to be here with you all this afternoon. there can be, as Mike was just saying, so many things for us to be thinking about and focusing on. I think Jamila and I will reiterate some of those things and hopefully give you all just a couple of, the next 20 minutes of a framework, a guidance of how to shrink the change for yourselves and really think to take a second to pull up. We're going to focus on, as was mentioned, your instructional plan for reentry of school, knowing full well that depending on your role, there are a lot of different things to also be thinking about in terms of how we want students to be reentering and our staff and adults to be reentering school, whatever that looks like. But just want to be upfront that that's our focus for the next 20 minutes or so. And with that, we're going to be upfront with a couple of assertions that Jamila and I are making here together. Jamila, I'm going to turn it over to you to share.
Thank you all for having us today. I'm really excited to talk to you about reentry for next year and especially instruction through my work at TNTP, thinking a lot about academics and support. And so as Rebecca shared, the first assertion that we're really making is that the work that we're going to be doing next year is really critical. And we're going to be really working to ensure we're closing learning gaps and getting students back on track. And so for many of you, that may mean really thinking about how to accelerate learning and or how to address unfinished learning from this year. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go today. What's going to be really important as we think about reentry is that it can be very easy to use next year to pick up all of the content that was missed in this year. But we're really going to talk about the importance of maintaining grade level expectations even next year, even though students may have missed some critical units, and we'll talk about what that can look like as well. And I know that everyone is dealing with a lot right now, and next year can feel very far off, but also very urgent. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to really start planning for next year right now and what that process and support might look like.
Thanks, Jamila. We realized that maybe some of you don't know who we are as organizations, and so just wanted to spend a second. I know we were introduced as individuals, but we are both part of much larger organizations, two nonprofits with distinct missions, but where we overlap in the Venn diagram, I think, of mission is that we both deeply care about educational equity, believe in the power of instructional leadership and the role that standards play to meet the goals of providing students with an equitable educational experience. Jamila, would you add anything?
I completely agree with that. TNTP and ANET have worked in lots of circles. I feel like they are my companions in lots of districts that I'm working in. And we really seek to support systems and districts and charter organizations and school sites with anything that is they're really seeing as a barrier to ensuring strong instruction and high expectations and grade level assignments for kids. And so that could be anything ranging from supporting with staffing and pipeline work for teachers to really training leaders and teachers on like what it takes to do the heavy lifting of strong instruction.
Thanks. And I would say we've come together here in this space to focus on both those places where we overlap in our mission to support schools and systems, as well as to leverage each of our unique strengths. And hopefully you hear about some of those things here. Jamila, do you want to talk about Padlet?
Yes. So we're really encouraging you to utilize the Q&A features as a part of the Zoom call, which are going ahead and asking questions via chat. But we've also set up a Padlet that we'll link to in the chat for you, where you can begin, like as you're hearing ideas and thoughts from us as well as colleagues, you can start kind of generating your own thinking for next year. So we have 4 questions in that Padlet. What information do you need, or what questions do you need to answer before you begin planning for entry? Who do you plan on including on your planning team? What actions will you and your planning team complete this month? And finally, what actions will you and your planning team complete in the following month? To just really start thinking. this is a way not only to get your thinking out, but to see from your other colleagues. So if anyone wants to be brave and start the chat there, we would really encourage you as a way to just start brainstorming together.
Thanks, Jamila. We believe in the power of the network, and also I think having transitioned to an almost exclusive virtual life are trying to make webinars a little bit more interactive and engaging for everyone too. As both a consumer, I understand what that feels like, as well as someone who's responsible for creating these kinds of experiences. So Jamila, we're going to start with some general principles, as we mentioned, and then we're going to get to some concrete strategies, and we're going to talk both about the here and now and some of the distance learning distance learning plans and the execution that's happening around those, and then move into the future planning. So go ahead, Jamila, do you want to talk about these principles and what we mean?
Yeah. So as you're planning for instruction next year, I think the first principle is to keep it really clear and simple. So there are a lot of moving parts in systems in schools. And I think I always talk to the folks and my clients and partners that I work with as, think of it as a game of telephone. Whatever message you originally send, someone is going to add multiple sentences, paragraphs, words to that message. So if you don't start out with a very simplistic, clear vision for what you're trying to accomplish, it will only be exacerbated. So keep it clear and keep it very simple. I think also when you're thinking about your instructional plan from a simplicity perspective, you want to hone in on the things that are most important to the content area. So for example, in ELA, you want to really think about your foundational skills instruction for your K-2 students. How am I making sure that that's really systematic and happening in a routinized way every single day? For literacy for 3 through 8 or 3 through 12, you also want to add in, you want to think about that building knowledge piece. So how am I ensuring that students are reading really rich, complex texts that build knowledge, and reading a volume of text? So those are the 3 things that you really want to hone in on as you think about your instructional plan, and make sure that you're highlighting what's most important within each subject. We want to make sure that you're holding high expectations for student success. The natural inclination might be to really utilize a lot of remediation strategies, so reteaching things that were lost this year, or packing units from this year into the beginning of next year. And we really discourage that behavior for a few reasons. One, research just tells us from a science of learning perspective that that is not helpful or effective when we think about what actually students need. We really encourage folks to use what we call just-in-time supports for students, which really call on learning principles tied to interleaving, spacing, best practices, etc., where you're really looking at and prioritizing the skills, the knowledge and skills that students may have needed from this grade level and applying them to the units for the next grade level. So you're thinking about, like, if you have a unit that's coming up for 3rd graders that's about fractions, if you have a unit for math, if you have a 4th grade unit on math that's about fractions, and you might say, oh my God, my students missed their fraction unit, because most fraction units fall at the very end of the year, you might feel this inclination to revisit every aspect of the fraction unit, but you really don't. You only need to talk about equivalent fractions, because that's what's there. They're going to need to be able to access 4th grade material. You don't have to go through all of the standards to really be ready. Addressing inequities head on. So often what happens is students in special populations, be it students who are English language or multilingual learners, students receiving special education services, even for students who are homeless or opportunity students, they're often thought of as a secondary thought, as opposed to really being the primary focus of your instructional plan. So as you're building your instructional plan for all students, you want to make sure that once you've figured out your vision for what am I doing for the majority of my students, you then begin to think of it as, like, what do I need to add to this system to support students who may be in a special population? I think it's also really important to support and assume the best of our stakeholders, parents, teachers, community members. Everyone at this time is going through an incredibly challenging experience. And so it's really important that we do our part by increasing the communication that we're sending out, by making sure we have really simplistic messages. As Mike alluded to earlier, establishing clear schedules and routines that everyone can follow and everyone knows their role and expectations, so that we can really build a community coalition around our schools and our community. And then I would say lean on community partners. Some folks have already been chatting with questions about crisis management and things like that. We recognize in our organization, I'm sure Rebecca feels the same way at ANET, is that we can't be the be-all, end-all. There are some things that we have limitations to our expertise, although our CEO, President Dan, might say we don't. We do have limitations to our expertise. And so I really encourage that folks are looking at their community partners here to think about social emotional supports, crisis management supports especially, because we don't want all of that to fall on just classroom teachers or even you as leaders in your buildings. So right now, you are probably really thinking about mitigating learning loss as much as possible in the spring. And as you get into planning for next year, you're going to really begin thinking about your instructional recovery plan. How are you getting students back on track and back into grade level appropriate materials as quickly as possible? And we've included a few things here on these slides to help guide some of your thinking. But I just want to zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the things that I think are really important. As we're thinking about recovery, as I shared before, the natural inclination may be to become very worried about recapturing or recovering every aspect of what students lost in this year. But learning science really tells us something different, that actually we can use principles like interleaving, like spacing, etc., to have students not only recover information, but retain it over a longer period of time. So what that really means is that we need to support teachers to look carefully at their units, to look carefully at their materials, and to look carefully at their standards to really say, what does it really take, or what will it really require for students to, in terms of prerequisite knowledge and skills, what will students really need to have in front of them in order to be able to participate in this on grade level material? And really pushing teachers to create a narrowed list of prerequisite skills and knowledge, and then potentially diagnosing or assessing those skill gaps to better understand what students actually have challenges with, so that you can really go into your year as effectively as possible.
Great, thanks, Jamila. And so you'll hear me reiterate some of the points that Jamila's made as we think about then planning for the instructional recovery that will happen in the fall. And I do want to highlight that like the general principles of strategic planning, even in this unprecedented time, remain the same. So these bullet points, again, as Jamila said, we've put some bullet points in here, and you'll have access to the slides. We've also created a note catcher for you in addition to the Padlet to be able to walk away from this call with, that you can actually use as a leader yourself with your team back at your school. But just want to say that these are probably things that if you've been involved in other strategic planning processes before will sound familiar to you. I think in times that feel different, in times of change, and as I mentioned at the top of the call, when it feels like we need to address everything, it's just important to remind ourselves about the good practices that we already know, and to pause and take a breath and say, right, these are ideas that I've embarked on before. These are strategic planning ideas that we've done before as a school, and the how of planning really isn't different. We'll talk a little bit about what to plan for that is different, but this idea of ensuring that first you have articulated the mission, vision, and guiding principles of your institution, your school, whether or not that is the mission it always has been, or whether or not you are going to be more explicit about addressing inequity, for example, head on. The idea of researching and knowing the current state of reality in the context of that mission and vision, what is actually happening and how do you know? And that is, again, not to evaluate, but really to get an accurate picture of current state so that you know where to go from there. Then to think about some strategic goals that you would set for yourself and your team and determine what the strategies, what all of the inputs and activities are for you to be able to meet the objectives that you set around those goals so that the outputs and outcomes are well matched to those inputs and activities. So this is the how, the sort of big picture. And as I mentioned, we're going to share with you a template that you can use when you walk away from this call and go back with your teams to talk about this kind of planning. And then the what of the planning is in some ways similar to what we might say in a typical school year. But a colleague was pushing my thinking just in a call just before this and thinking like, we actually have an opportunity here to not go back to like business as usual in terms of the what. As Jamila has mentioned, we know that inequities exist already. They existed before COVID-19 and before these gaps in schooling. And this is actually an opportunity to say, what would we want to be true for all of our learners in our school community? What do we want to be true, not so that we get back to the status quo of what was happening prior to this disruption, but so that we think innovatively about how to meet the needs of all learners. As this colleague shared, like remediation has actually never been successful. And to Jamila's point, learning science tells us if we do take the approach entering next year of saying, first we have to do all of these things that students may have missed, we run the risk of never getting to the grade level standards and the grade level expectations of the current year, and we will find ourselves in a perpetual remediation mode. So while this is a difficult time, it is also on a optimistic day. I feel like a time for all of us to collectively think about how to really disrupt those inequities for all of the learners that are a part of our school communities. So there are a couple of technical things to think about in your planning processes, right? So you want to prepare and think about how you'll measure the efficacy of the distance learning efforts from this spring. Some of you, I've had the pleasure actually of seeing some of your distance learning plans, being a part of that, are doing great work engaging students in distance learning. I do want to just like mention when I say measure the efficacy, there's an intentional choice not to use the word assess. I think what can be another common pitfall is to want to assess and diagnose and know exactly what the things were that were lost in the spring as a part of the distance learning plan. And while there is a place for very strategic diagnosis and assessment, in no way would either Jamila or I say that adding more tests is something that should be happening, and in no way would we say that that's actually how we want students to be, their experience re-entering school in the fall. And so you'll hear me talk about diagnose and measure and assess, and really it's an opportunity to pull up from what you were doing with your current assessment strategy overall and say, what if this still makes sense? And what if this actually no longer serves the purpose that it once did, or it actually was never serving the purpose that we thought it might be? It's just an opportunity to take stock of all of those things so that you do have the information you need. And Jamila made the point earlier to like really pinpoint and target prerequisite skills and standards that can be interwoven, and not to forego those grade level standards because we know that those are the most important things for students to be able to compete with their peers in an academic way, in an academic sense. So that's that bullet point number 2, maintain focus on the major work of the grade and elements of proficient reading. We don't want to be caught in a cycle of remediation. And also related to number 3, leveraging data. Not more data, the right data. Thinking about what data points you really truly care about and want to collect, being smart and strategic about that, and thinking about how that fits within the bigger picture of a student's experience and what value that's going to provide for the teachers at your school and for you as a leader as well. It was mentioned earlier, I think it was Mike, and then again by Jamila. We recognize the social and emotional supports that are going to be necessary to be put in place for students, given the disruption in not just their education, but the change, the large change that they're experiencing in their lives. But we also just want to reiterate how much adults are experiencing that as well. And as leaders of your school, I think there's both the learning and like knowledge and skills to provide to adults to ensure that they can meet the demands of what school might look like next year and a reentry might look like. How to do those more targeted alongside maybe prerequisite skills instead of before they get to grade level standards. There's all of the technical knowledge and skill, but there's also the emotional balance and stability that the adults need too. And just feel, you know, a responsibility to name that that's always true. Like good leadership requires that you take care of your people, and that can look a lot of different ways. But especially now, to be thinking about how adults have experienced this, not only in their professional lives, but in their personal lives as well. So I'm going to turn over to Jamila to talk just a little bit about a timeline. I will put the caveat that this is meant to be guidance, not in any way some sort of strict idea, especially as many folks have mentioned. You know, we are in uncertain times in terms of when reentry to school may happen. And so this is assuming we are planning for fall and the instructional recovery plan for fall. Jamila, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so when we think about timeline, we mentioned a little bit earlier that like using this time now to begin kind of thinking about the fall. Because this is going to be a really intentional process of pre-planning, we want to give you as much time as possible. So you may not want to wait until July. So in terms of like what you could be doing right now is assembling your instructional recovery team and really being thoughtful about how wide and how narrow you want to make this. And by how wide, it means that, like I said before, you may need to pull on more community members than you have in the past in thinking about your recovery because you recognize some of the supports that you might need. You may want to bring in teachers or parents or paraprofessionals or interventionists or whomever you think makes the most sense given your student population and their specific demographic needs, or what you've learned from your data collection in the spring in terms of challenges they may have had or barriers they may have experienced. As I said before, engaging community stakeholders. So as you're returning, there's going to be a lot on your plate and a lot on the plates of all of the adults in your building. So you really want to begin thinking about like, what is in our locus of control? Where do we think we can really knock it out of the park? What lane do we as educators want to play in? And where do I need supports? Because we just can't drive in that lane right now. We don't have the capacity, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the time or whatever. For all of those things that may fall outside of your lane, that's where you want to really think about engaging your community partners. And so thinking about that as early as possible so that you can begin making those connections. In mid-May, you really want to start establishing a high-level plan. And what that means is as you've pulled together your team, helping them understand, okay, I want 50% of your time really spent on thinking about reentry and 50% of your time focused on the here and now. And as you're thinking about reentry, here's what we're going to tackle first, second, third, fourth, fifth. So just making sure that you've given folks a prioritized list and timelines for them to check in with you and or to produce whatever you're needing. So if you're needing a revised scope and sequence that really highlights how you're picking up content from this year and putting it into the units and your scope and sequence for next year, maybe you say a date of June, having that initial draft, making sure that folks are clear with that expectation for you. By June, you also want to just start having yourself like fully hired and having roles and expectations in place. In terms of the staffing piece, it's going to be really important that you begin talking to new hires as early as possible about your expectations for reentry, especially if they were hired at a time before COVID and those expectations for their role have dramatically changed given the closures that have occurred and where you may need them to fill capacity into next year. And then finally, you want to make sure that you have a communicated plan in place to provide support and development so that it doesn't just stay trapped with your leadership teams or even with your teachers, that you've communicated your plan for what recovery will look like with your entire community. So parents, students, teachers, etc., so that everyone is on the same page about expectations for next year, how the work will look the same and how the work will look different. Again, to really set up that social emotional support to begin preparing people for the experience or the routines or the schedules that they'll be engaging in. And then finally, even though you have a plan in place, we always know, as we know with regular strategic planning or progress monitoring, there's going to need to be the need for adjustments. So you're going to want to both plan for adjustments, but also plan for how you're progress monitoring, who you're bringing together to look at and to review the data that you're collecting, either qualitative, quantitative, or anecdotal data that you're collecting about your progress, and how you'll communicate any changes that are needing to occur because of the data that you've collected.
Awesome, thanks, Jamila. We've been talking all about the things that you as leaders need to plan for and how to think about that planning. But also want to acknowledge that you are the person or on a team of people that bring this plan to life, and in fact are also experiencing disruptions in your life and both professional and personal. So want to think about a question here to pose back to all of you as you think about yourself as a leader in whatever role you sit in. And I know we have a variety of folks who are in different roles on the call. What are you going to need to do for yourself in order to support a plan like this and keep the stamina and self-care to implement it? Just take a second. This might be a little awkward on a webinar, but to pause, maybe even close your eyes and think about that. What is it that you are going to need, either emotionally and from a social standpoint and or from a technical standpoint? And then we're gonna encourage you to, if you have been all along, we'll see, this is the big reveal, capturing your thoughts in the Padlet, to take a couple of minutes to think about those questions, also with the lens of taking care of yourself, and think about those questions that Jamila introduced at the beginning. What information do you need? What questions do you need to answer? I see we have some folks that have been doing some processing and thinking. What do you plan on, who do you plan on including on your team? What actions will you and your planning team complete this month? And what actions do you want to complete in the following month? Realizing that this is just scraping the surface, but wanting to be able to get, have some space to get some thoughts and ideas out there right now. And then finally, as I mentioned, what we'll share in the materials, as Anna mentioned in the chat, will be available, is an editable template that takes all of these ideas, both the ones that are presented on the slides and those that you may have heard Jamila and I talk about, the guiding principles, as the thinking about the process of strategic planning, and then some of the what of strategic planning. You can make a copy for yourself. You can do with what you like and add to and take away. But we thought this might be helpful as just a concrete tool to be able to take some of these messages that you're hearing now back to your team and your school to get started. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to some of the other panelists for some Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Jamila and Rebecca, for your presentation, a wealth of information. I think we're all set with questions. Everybody was great.
Yamika, we have a couple that came through the chat and not the Q&A. And so I think one that I think is a great global question is, as people are thinking through these scenario plannings, and so I give this to everyone here because I think as we're all experiencing a lot of the best answers that folks are getting to questions right now is to do your best, to access resources, to ask for help, and then to do your best. But about, so Rebecca and Jamila, you talked about scenario planning, right? And thinking about, you know, next year potentially in some different contexts. Either if schools are doing that, and there are particular scenarios, how would you advise them to think about prioritizing, either in terms of how to create scenarios, the principles to consider in creating them, or how to rank order some of the competing priorities? So for example, equity versus equality in terms of access to resources, either brick and mortar or otherwise, safety versus you know, broad scope of access. So Rebecca, Jamila, but also Catherine, Mike, David, Susie, Aaron, any words of wisdom? It's a really easy question, I know.
Yeah, like I'll jump in first with like a high level thing that I would say, which is kind of getting it's not an answer exactly, but one recommendation I would make is to never skip the sort of mission vision work, and to get very, very clear about what it is, because I think the answers may be different depending on the community that you serve and your school design and your school mission. But to get very, very clear about what it is that is most important to you and your school community, so that you can do that kind of prioritization, so that you can contingency plan in a way that is aligned to your mission and vision. I think it is like very easy to get very tactical, and we need tactical. But I will say in the long run, that part of the process will pay a lot of dividends in terms of the outcomes that you actually seek.
Yeah, I agree. I think in terms of prioritization, I think it's starting with like a narrow list of like, what is the goal that you have? And so for me, I would kind of say like, my goal is to be providing high quality instruction with the right materials every day for kids. What barriers does your particular system or school have in supporting that as the goal? And then listing those out. So it might be, it might be that like, we don't have enough teacher capacity. I have a pipeline issue, or we have some virtual learning needs or technology issues that are precluding students from getting that right now. And I'm nervous about that, what that might mean for next year if we have to kind of go back into closures. So after you've thought through that and your barriers, then it's about kind of force ranking which of those is the highest priority. And I would say like not having enough teachers is probably the highest issue that you would want to tackle first. But in order to tackle that, you have to have a plan first. Like, what do I actually need teachers to do instructionally? So therefore, how many teachers do I need to have in place in order to do that? Or how can I be more flexible with that plan once I have a vision for what I'm trying to accomplish? And what I mean by that is saying like, come up with your instructional vision and then think about your barriers, as opposed to thinking about the barriers first to your instructional vision. Because what inevitably happens is you start lowering the bar for your instructional vision, because you're like, oh, well, by the time you get through all of your barriers, you may not have even an instructional core to hang anything on. So that's the way I would kind of approach prioritizing and thinking about
Jamila, I just have to, I don't want to get in front of anyone else responding to this, but that really resonates. And I think this idea of having a vision is hugely powerful, because you guys did a great job talking about prioritizing student needs and thinking about student needs. But staff has lived through this as well. And they have you know, trauma and needs of their own. And so if they don't have something to say yes to, there's not necessarily a lot of reason for them to be the first people back in the building. And that has to feel, luckily, I think one of the amazing things about working with charters is how many people are so committed to the vision and the mission of the work of charters in New York and to their school, but never a better time than to underscore that and to link it to what that means in terms of the specific plan and the activities that you're asking people to participate in. Other thoughts in terms of mental models or frameworks or things to prioritize, either in prioritizing between contingency plans or factors in creating those plans? Folks from SUNY, David, Erin, Anjali. All right, if not, Yumika, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. I want to say, first of all, thank you for everyone for participating today. Panelists, as always, just the stars of the show, and that's awesome. We are wrapped for today, folks. We will see you next Tuesday for our weekly webinar, and we'll be back again on Thursday for a deep dive webinar at 4 p.m., at which we will address student recruitment and enrollment in the context of social distancing. Everyone, have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.